The choice between war and peace is turned over to those of one political party who stand to gain vast wealth by ensuring that there is never peace but only war. And now, when just one cooked book gets corrected by an honest auditor, when just one trampling of the inherent and inviolable fairness of government is rejected by an impartial judge, when just one wild-eyed partisan is stopped by the figure of blind justice, this president decides that he, and not the law, must prevail. I accuse you, Mr. Bush, of lying this country into war. I accuse you of fabricating in the minds of your own people a false implied link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. I accuse you of firing the generals who told you that the plans for Iraq were disastrously insufficient. I accuse you of causing in Iraq the needless deaths of 3,586 of our brothers and sons and sisters and daughters and friends and neighbors. I accuse you of subverting the Constitution, not in some misguided but sincerely motivated struggle to combat terrorists, but instead to stifle dissent. I accuse you of fomenting fear among your own people, of creating the very terror you claim to have fought. I accuse you of exploiting that unreasoning fear, the natural fear of your own people who just want to live their lives in peace, as a political tool to slander your critics and libel your opponents. I accuse you of handing part of this republic over to a vice president who is without conscience and letting him run roughshod over it. And I accuse you now, Mr. Bush, of giving, through that vice president, carte blanche to Mr. Libby to help defame Ambassador Joseph Wilson by any means necessary, to lie to grand juries and special counsel and before a court in order to protect the mechanisms and the particulars of that defamation with your guarantee that Libby would never see prison. And in so doing, as Ambassador Wilson himself phrased it here last night, of you becoming an accessory to the obstruction of justice. When President Nixon ordered the firing of Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox during the infamous Saturday Night Massacre on October 20th, 1973, Mr. Cox initially responded tersely and ominously. Whether ours shall be a government of laws and not of men, he said, is now for Congress and ultimately the American people. President Nixon did not understand how he had crystallized the issue of Watergate for the American people. It had been to that point about the obscure meaning behind an attempt to break into a rival party's headquarters and the labyrinthine effort to cover up that break-in and the related crimes. But in one night, Nixon transformed it. Watergate instantaneously became a simpler issue, a president overruling the inexorable march of the law, of insisting in a way that resonated viscerally with millions who had not previously understood that he was the law. Not the Constitution, not the Congress, not the courts, just him. Just, Mr. Bush, as you did yesterday. The twists and turns of Plaingate, your precise and intricate lies that sent us into this bottomless pit of Iraq, your lies upon the lies to discredit Joe Wilson, your lies upon the lies upon the lies to throw the sand at the referee, of Prosecutor Fitzgerald's analogy. These are complex and often painful to follow, and too much perhaps for the average citizen. But when other citizens render a verdict against your man, Mr. Bush, and then you spit in the faces of those jurors and that judge and the judges who are yet to hear the appeal, the average citizen understands that, sir. It is the fixed ball game and the rigged casino and the prearranged lottery all rolled into one, and it stinks. And they know it. Nixon's mistake, the last and most fatal of them, the firing of Archibald Cox, was enough to cost him the presidency. And in the end, even Richard Nixon could say he could not put this nation through an impeachment. It was far too late for it to matter then. But as the decades unfold, that single final gesture of nonpartisanship, of acknowledged responsibility not to self, not to party, not to base, but to country, echoes loudly into history. Even Richard Nixon knew it was time to resign. Would that you could say that, Mr. Bush, and that you could say it for Mr. Cheney. You both crossed the Rubicon yesterday. Which one of you chose the route no longer matters. Which is the ventriloquist and which is the dummy is now irrelevant. But that you have twisted the machinery of our government into nothing more than a tawdry machine of politics is the only fact that remains relevant. It is nearly July 4th, Mr. Bush, the commemoration of the moment we Americans decided that rather than live under a king who made up the laws or erased them or ignored them or commuted the sentences of those rightly convicted under them, we would force our independence and regain our sacred freedoms. We of this time and our leaders in Congress of both parties must now live up to those standards which echo through our history. Pressure, negotiate, impeach. Yet you, Mr. Bush, and Mr. Cheney, two men who are now perilous to our democracy, away from its helm. And for you, Mr. Bush, and for Mr. Cheney, there is a lesser task. You need merely to achieve a very low threshold indeed. Display just that iota of patriotism which Richard Nixon showed on August 9, 1974. Resign. 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 Resign.